Okay, so it's 10:30. I suggest we can start now, just to be on time. So thank you for sending your papers and for presenting in this session today about old ideas. We have 4 papers. So let's try to keep it to 15 minutes, say, and that would give us time to discuss and have questions and comments from the participants in the session. So our first presenters are John Berdell and Jose Manuel Menudo, and they will be talking about jealousy of credit and fear of money from John Locke to Henry Thornton. So I pass it to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimena. And I believe you're seeing my screen, but I'd like to start with a remembrance of Jeff Harcourt, who was my supervisor and has supervised quite a few people in the association, in the society, and is a distinguished fellow of the society who passed away at age 90. He was not only a very famous historian of the Cambridge School, Joan Robinson in particular, but was willing to undertake supervision of theses in very different areas, such as classical economics. And he was also, which bears on our presentation today, a passionate anti-war activist in Australia before returning to Cambridge, eventually as reader in the history of economic thought. So we turn now to the paper, Jealousy of Credit and Fear of Money. And my co-author, Jose Menudo, is with us to answer questions at the end, and I'll try to move things along by making the main presentation. By jealousy of credit, what we mean is Chauvelin's definition that jealousy of credit is an anxious watchfulness directed towards the public credit of other nations. And by fear of money, we mean that, well, once you've got money into the country through a balance of trade surplus, various thinkers are very nervous about the fact that more money will create higher prices, and this will in fact erode the export surplus that one had successfully generated from the beginning. And in using that phrase, the jealousy of credit, we're of course echoing the jealousy of trade, a famous essay by Hume that is the title of István Hans's classic, really breakthrough book, examining the tension between rivalry and cooperation, between trade and war in the long 18th century. And we see in this picture here from István's book, Reason of State here has a dress with ears and eyes on it, which is that wary watchfulness, and she is ready to loose the lion, which has no leash. So credit and money were very conflictive issues at times during the long 18th century. And Sophus Reinhardt points out that it's very difficult to pin down a clear line between quote unquote mercantilism, whatever that means, and liberalism, because Carey's pamphlet, Essay on the State of England, was actually retranslated through 3 European languages across the century. And as it was retranslated, it became less and less bellicose, and it became more and more a prospectus for peaceful relations between states. And Chauvin and others remind us that actually the idea that merchants drove trade wars, it's far easier to see that in the 1740s and 1750s than earlier in the century. So Hume and Smith's great war with great fear of trade war, reflects the time they were writing. We're going to look at some authors who expressed one of these two jealousies or fears. Lawn Mellon just expressing the jealousy of commerce, Cantillon, Montesquieu, Hume just expressing the fear of money, Forbonnais and Stewart expressing both, Turgot and Smith trying to get away from both of these problems. And then we're going to argue to you that it's really with Henry Thornton that we change the discourse, and the literature does move away from these two polarities of jealousy of credit and fear of money. We start with John Locke, of course, who expresses the jealousy of credit in three different dimensions. First, his early essay on a land bank is pitched at landowners who want to get some of the power and resources that credit brings, which merchants have had. Secondly, he's writing for a Scottish audience, which is jealous of English credit. And then, of course, his system in France is very much aimed at a French attempt to harness the credit facilities that England has been benefiting from. And money and trade considered in 1705 moves away from the rather stable propositions he made before and suddenly is articulating the idea that money can drive trade. And very importantly, money not only boosts output, it boosts exports and the balance of payments. So we have here economic populism in the sense that credit can increase output with no problems in inflation and the balance of payments. This little item here on inflation equal to a function of the change in the interest rate is subtly important in that Locke gets the idea that inflation occurs when interest rates fall, not when they're too low. And that becomes quite important for his system. He drives the price of shares of his company up until the dividend is 2%. There's evidence to suggest that he's targeting a 2% interest rate, lower than Holland, lower than England. Once he hits that target price, he tries to stabilize the shares, but the whole system is predicated on the price continuing to rise, so it doesn't work out well. Cantillon, who we'll be meeting soon, is long in the system at the beginning, and then shorts it once it starts to fall. And in terms of the mercantilist versus liberal dimension, Locke, we feel, is much more on the mercantilist end of things. He promises the regent that France will be the arbiter of Europe when he's putting the system together. Later in life, he suggests that his plan would have kept Europe in peace, but presumably a peace with French hegemony. Mellon was Locke's secretary, and he also rejects territorial expansion, universal monarchy as it was called, in favor of commercial expansion and the creation of credit. And his island model at the beginning of the essay has one island with a lot of land and a lot of credit, eventually dominating the others and giving the law to the others. He recognizes that there can be inflation due to credit, but we hypothesize that he's really thinking that he can devalue or augment the currency and so get away from inflationary problems. Both Locke and Mellon are jealous of credit, they're for credit expansion, and they have no fear of money, unlike Cantillon, who is the classic statement of fear of money. He has an essay in which the supply side, the land constraint, always binds. There's never any room for demand or credit to move activity, and his aim is maximum population, and that maximum population should be obtained by changing the structure of the economy so as to maximize employment and population. Quote here that nations which which support other countries' labor forces are being duped. You want to change trade so that your workers are being supported by foreigners. And he does refer to neighboring countries and what we today would call trading partners as potential enemies. And so that is the most obviously mercantilistic aspect of it. How can we maximize population and stimulate the economy through trade? Well, we should have a balance of trade surplus. How can we maintain a balance of trade surplus? We should withdraw money. The prince should withdraw money from the economy and lock it up for emergencies, try to retard the circulation. So we have tremendous fear of money and no desire to create new credit facilities. Montesquieu, we're going to quickly say, is somewhat similar. He notes that countries are limited by in commerce by inflows of gold, which raise prices, and he rejects a Bank of England. He's famously known by Al Hirschman as the origin of the du commerce thesis that commerce brings peace. But, right after he sets out that thesis in the spirit of the laws, he's talking about how commerce creates war between commercial powers. So he's aware of the both elements and suggests, following Saint-Pierre, that Europe should have a federal structure similar to what German states have been slowly putting together. So we'll now move to Hume's tremendous fear of money. His price specie flow is by no means the first. You see a list of four precursors here. Hume's price specie flow certainly does not demonstrate the futility of pursuing a trade surplus, as is almost always said of it. That idea that it shows it's futile comes from the Balance of Trade essay, but his essay of money recognizes that monetary inflows stimulate output. And so he concludes in the essay of money that the good policy of the magistrate should be to keep money still increasing. Well, how do you keep money still increasing? How do you keep a balance of trade surplus going? Well, he's a bit leery of Cantillon's suggestion that we should hoard money in a public hoard, which he seems to be aware of. Instead, he suggests that there should be a public bank, which is 100% reserved to try and absorb as much money as possible. And that's an idea that recently has been discussed by Eisenman and Lee, that mercantilism and precautionary reserve balance accumulation are very close cousins. At any rate, Forbonnais and Stewart we move to now because they're both jealous of credit. They want to increase credit, and they're quite aware that credit can generate inflation, which they're afraid of. So what are they going to do about this tension? Forbonnais and his Elements of Commerce, in fact, points out that monetary inflows in a financialized system, in a system in which any savings gets recircled by banks as investment, financialized systems multiply the effect of trade surpluses, and they multiply the effect of trade deficits. So he's very, very worried about inflows and outflows, particularly because he makes the proposition that prices are sticky. So anytime we have changes in demand, it shows up in activity and employment, and he thinks that down times will have strong emigration, which will greatly contract the economy. So realizing that banks do also cause inflation, what is the position of Forbonnais? And we think Stewart and Forbonnais are similar in that, if prices are low in the economy and credit is scarce, you should emphasize credit creation. But if prices are high and credit is relatively abundant in comparison with other countries, you should emphasize credit contraction. So what we say of them is that therefore control essentially of credit, therefore both increase or decrease of credit, but control by government is essential. Turgot looks for a very different kind of solution. And he looks for, we haven't investigated this in depth, but he's looking for some way of making the monetary stock correspond to the real stock of capital in the economy. And in that way, moving away from those forms of intervention. That's a bit similar to Adam Smith, who suggested 3 rules on bank. The essential one for us is the real bills doctrine, that banks should only print new money in exchange for real output that has been created by a merchant. That would keep the monetary stock in parallel to some extent with real output. And he, in addition, has his monetary approach to the balance of payments, which says that anytime there might be too much money relative to money demand, all that happens is that the excess gold and silver get exported, and that Britain will import real capital goods in return for that exported gold and silver. Therefore, we don't need to really worry about money. No fear of money, and less fear of credit. It's not pushing more credit, but we can have more credit. So he's trying to move away from both jealousy and fear. And he notes, similar to Cantillon, that the pattern of the economy, the structure of demand matters a great deal. And its ending of the Wealth of Nations is that the structure of the economy has been pushing the economy towards capital-intensive activities, away from labor-intensive activities. And by doing that, it's been lowering the demand for labor, and it's been lowering the growth rate of the economy. And we need to get away, in the closing passages of the Wealth of Nations, we need to get away from a vicious cycle of trade wars, which cause taxation, and debt, which cause a lack of competitiveness, which cause more trade wars. And as I mentioned at the outset, Chauvelin reminds us that actually merchants driving war seems a better fit for the 1740s and 50s than earlier periods. So let's look back at our authors. And the quote unquote mercantilist ones and liberal ones do share certain analytical elements here. We have Cantillon and Hume very, very close together in terms of their analysis of the output effects of money and their analysis of why the state should try and suppress monetary growth as best it can. We have a similarity between Hume and Cantillon on the structure of the economy, pushing the economy towards labor-intensive activities and boosting either population or wages by so doing. But we have great differences between our authors. We have Law and Milon, economic populists who are pushing credit expansion with very little restraint. We have Forbonnais and Stewart, who have similar inclinations, but are both for control on the expansion and the contraction side. And then we have our fear of money authors, Cantillon, Montesquieu, and Hume, all of them trying to constrain credit with no credit expansion. Turgot and Smith trying to sidestep these issues. But finally, I put it to you that the way this discussion gets resolved or transformed is when Britain leaves gold in 1790s. And in 1802, Henry Thornton publishes his very important paper credit, which theorizes what this means. And what it really means for Thornton is that by leaving gold, Britain can manage the money market without worrying about, on the other hand, the balance of trade. So we can work on the two independently. We can manage the two independently. And Thornton is always ready, he says, once we get back on gold, we should be ready to leave it anytime the two come in conflict. So by breaking the link between credit conditions and the balance of trade, we resolve the tension between a jealousy of credit and fear of money. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. So maybe we can have like 5 minutes for people if anybody has questions or comments at this time. Very silent room. So I'll ask a question. Maybe it's an obvious question because I don't know much about the topic. I was wondering how we should understand colonies in this context. Are colonies, because I'm thinking about sources of power, I tend to see that there might be kind of a change in views that we're at first, in the first authors that you presented, there is this concern about state power, and it kind of moves to more fear of war rather than source of power. They go hand in hand, obviously, but I see like a change in emphasis in both. And so that's my question. How should we understand colonies? Are they a source of commerce, or are they a source of land? Especially if we connect this to the last part of the Wealth of Nations, where Smith is saying, get rid of the colonies. Does that make like a argumentative line in any sense?
That's interesting. I don't know if Jose wants to jump in.
Well, no, maybe John can answer the question, because maybe the only case is Adam Smith. The other are out of this matter.
Yeah. So I would recommend the work by Chauvelin very much, Jimena, on these points, because these new historian Alimento that I cited there, because they point out that Santo Domingo, the sugar trade was far more important than anything, say, in what became the United States. So I don't think it was so much a source of land, but it certainly was a source of tremendous wealth, and across the period, what I think you do see is people moving away from any discussion of gold and silver to discussions of what is the real wealth coming out through sugar and the profits from the sugar trade. The discussion in the wealth of nations is extremely problematic, as I'm sure you know better than I do, because Adam Smith has that very strange proposition that the slave trade is less profitable than free labor would be, and he has his own rhetorical reasons for doing that, which I think are his oppositions to slavery. But it really confuses things quite tremendously, right, when we come to discuss what really were the contributions of colonialism to British development, to British what would become industrialization somewhat after Smith's time. So with Smith, I think that really is a very, very problematic element. The land issue does come up because we know that Smith foresees that if Britain would establish a States General of the British Empire, America's great land resources would mean that it would become the economic basis for that larger polity, and the seat of empire would move to the United States. So I think it's an interesting question that you bring up, and I've only been able to kind of skirt around the edges of it, Jimena, I know. And it is an interesting question that we should think more about, trying to move through the early authors to the later authors. I can't, it's sort of interesting to think about where would you put the Louisiana in all of this, given that, the Regent and Law may have thought that it was going to really come online as a serious big resource in the future. But we know that Cantillon was well aware, because he had a relation in New Orleans at the time, who told him that this place is going nowhere. There's nothing here, just disease. So it's an interesting question, which I can't answer, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you both. Any other questions or comments? Yes, I saw Richard putting your hand up and then putting it down. So Richard, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Richard.
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm on an unfamiliar computer, so I don't know whether it works. Hi, thank you. I walked in a bit late. I'm sorry. So maybe you've answered this, but I was wondering whether there's merit in distinguishing between public and private credit and the views of people on this. I was the first person I heard you discuss was Forbonnet, for example. He is very much in favor, the way I see it, in the development of public credit, borrowing facilities by the state in imitation of the big enemy, Great Britain. And indeed, much more careful about the effects of developing private credit. So, and I was wondering whether that would be a good thing to also bring throughout as a theme in your paper.
Richard, I think so, and we've not done so, so we ought to. Because I think you're quite right, because implicitly we start out with Chauvelin and this all being about public credit, but they're all mixed together because Law's early pamphlet is really private credit, a land bank, and then it awkwardly moves over to public credit. So you're absolutely quite right, but I don't have any quick reply to you, other than yes, something that needs to be tracked, and I'm not entirely sure what comes out from doing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now I think we'll move to the next paper by Pierre Januard, Licit and Illicit Risks in Thomas Aquinas' De Emptione et Venditione ad Tempus. My Latin is amazing, I know. So Pierre, thank you.
Thank you very much. I just put the okay. Okay. Good afternoon to all. Let's go for a journey to the Middle Ages. I will talk about licit and illicit risks in Thomas Aquinas' De Emptione et Venditione et Tempus. First of all, Aquinas' De Emptione et Venditione et Tempus is a short letter concerning the forward sale. De Emptione constitutes the second early work after the commentary on the sentences and before the major writings such as the Quaestio 77 and 78 of the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. As it deals with forward sales, De Emptione links usury and just price. It also provides elements for understanding what the just price is, especially in the debate between market price and price by production costs. For this reason, it is sometimes known and used, and this is what I was able to discuss in a previous paper. But De Emptione is very interesting for a much less known point that appears rather at the end of the text, in the third part of the text. Aquinas says what can and cannot be included into the price. Thus, beyond the specific question of forward sales, De Emptione deals with the sale in general by specifying which cost can or cannot be recovered by the merchant in the sale price. This is what we are going to talk about today. The first cost is the cost of waiting. It can be a cost because of time, which is usury, or a cost through time just because of price fluctuation. Therefore, there is a link between usury and an unjust price in such an intertemporal exchange in the forward sale. That is the most famous point of De Emptione. But this text also presents the two other costs, licit and illicit expenses. That means expenses that the merchant can or cannot include in the selling price. Transport is the paradigmatic licit cost. It belongs to the proper activity of the merchant. Aquinas extends it to other licit costs. On the contrary, Aquinas presents the expenses that cannot be incorporated into the price. The paradigm of these expenses is borrowing. If the merchant borrows to develop his business, it is illicit for three reasons that we will see in a moment. In fact, what will unify illicit expenditure is the notion of imprudence. Aquinas adds to borrowing the expenses made incaute or imprudenter, which I have chosen to translate as without precaution and unwisely. I will explain why. So, what can we rely on to conduct the study of licit and illicit expenditure? The status questionis in the literature has three characteristics. First, the literature on De Emptione is very limited. Apart from the introduction in the Leonine critical edition of Thomas Aquinas and a brief presentation in different books about Aquinas. Secondly, the text is never studied and rarely mentioned in the economic literature. The few times it is used, it is on the link between usury and just price, or between price on the market and just price, but never on the subject that concerns us today. Finally, we can, of course, rely on books and works about Aquinas or scholastics, providing a conceptual elucidation of the notion of usury, a rediscovery of the primacy of justice in the just price, and the framework given to the activity of the merchant. Let's now analyze what licit and illicit expenses tell us. First of all, De Emptione does not talk about risk, but about expenses. expensas in Latin. Expenses of transport and other expenses which can be licitly recovered in the price, and expenses such as the interest of a loan, or expenses made incaute et imprudenter, which cannot be recovered. However, there are two elements that lead to read this expenditure as a risk. Firstly, the vocabulary used in the emptione bears witness to a risk, as the lexical study shows. The verb recuperare carries an element of risk: to recover a city taken by the enemy, to recover one's property. Recovery is not a foregone conclusion. Then there are the term incaute et imprudenter, which refer to the virtue of prudence that involve a risk. We will study them further in a moment, but the first meaning of prudence is one who foresees. And in the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas quotes Isidore of Seville, from whom the prudent person sees the vicissitude of uncertain things. Secondly, we see that Aquinas' vocabulary evolves to risk lexicon. Whereas the emptione speaks of expenses, De Regno, 3 years later, makes a first step. It uses a more polysemious expression and is more risk-oriented. Supply, said De Regno, supply is prevented by war because of various difficulties of communications, diversa viarum discrimina, but discriminam means distance, separation, difficulties, but also crisis, and by extension, risk. A second step is made by the Summa Theologiae. Transport is presented as a periculum, not only an expenditure, but also a danger. Moreover, the emphasis is more on the distance and on the transfer of the good, on its movement, transferando, than on the physical work of transporting a bulky good, such as clothes, as in De Emptione, where we found the more physical word importatione. So we can treat expenses as risks because expenses are risky expenses. For transport, the risk is not only to be repaid through the price, but that the goods never arrive to the Lagny fair, Lagny next to Paris in France, the fair mentioned by Aquinas. On the licit risk of transport, I will be very brief because time is running out and I do not want to be too long. The challenge is to ensure that this risk, this licit risk, is borne by a licit framework. This is what Aquinas is concerned with in the Summa Theologiae, with the model of societas, which is not alone and therefore does not fall under the prohibition of usury taken up by Gregory IX Decretal Naviganti. It should also be noted that the transition between the study of transport as an expenditure in the Emptione to a risk in the Summa Theologiae follows with delay the lexical evolution found in Gregory IX Decretals. We can return to this issue of transport and illicit risk in the discussion, but it seems more interesting to focus here on illicit risks, which are the least studied. The general framework is given by the loan made by the merchant. Merchant, I read, cannot, however, recover the interest payment they have made. 3 reasons are given. First, it was an unjust payment. Second, they have sinned in paying this interest since they have given the usurer an opportunity to sin. Third, the necessity which they allege to live more honorably and to extend their trade is not sufficient to exempt them from this sin. This leads to 3 remarks. The first is that Aquinas distances himself from the conditioned will, the idea that the borrower always borrows out of necessity and that lending at interest would always be in the configuration of the rich enslaving the poor. The second remark is that Aquinas does not yet see lending as a means of developing economic activity and business. Lending remains an illicit act, and the borrower, when not acting out of necessity, contributes to the sin of the lender. The third point is that Aquinas rejects the subjective claim of the merchant. He bases his view not on subjective, not on the subjective claim, but on objective elements of justice, the nature of the expenditure. This is in line with what we find in Aquinas' other writings. Since he does not have access to the agent intention, which is hidden, he looks for an objective indicator of the justice of the exchange, such as the price or the nature of the goods or the expenditure or the good exchanged. Aquinas adds to the loan, the cost of which cannot be recovered, other illicit expenses. Expenses made without precaution and unwisely. Expensas quas incaute et imprudente fecissent. It is therefore a question of expenses incurred due to imprudence. That brings us to the virtue of prudence. A caveat should then be made here. Prudence is a virtue as a matter of discernment and judgment about a moral matter. So it is not an economic calculation. However, what we now consider as prudence in the sense of Kimball 1990 is closer to Aquinas' position than one might have thought. Thus, when Aquinas emphasized the fact that the merchant acts imprudently, this means that the merchant does not make full use of the information available to him about the effect of his decisions. The imprudence described in the emptione is the increasing weight of the possibility of loss compared to what would be prudent behavior. This is consistent with the nowadays approach, where imprudence refers to a leftward spread of the curve representing the probability density function. The trader does not develop an attraction for risk in the sense that he would prefer spread distribution to concentrated distributions, but an imprudence one in the sense that he would prefer distribution spread in the direction of losses, negative skewness, to concentrated distribution. In the emptione, this imprudence takes two forms, incaute et imprudente. The lexical studies shows that the nuance between these two terms. The adverb incaute means carelessly, without precaution, negligently. This describes the merchant who is negligent. He borrows or incurs expenses without worrying about his ability to bear them, and he wants to integrate them a posteriori into the selling price because he has not anticipated their coverage. The adverb imprudente has apparently a close meaning, but it means but it means more unwisely, by mistake, by ignorance, without being able to foresee, with a noetic meaning. The merchant who acts imprudenter is not necessarily negligent, although it could be possible, but he makes expenditure that are not in keeping with his ignorance or knowing of the future. Or saying it differently, he does not use properly information he has. There are therefore two levels of merchant imprudence: negligence and failure to anticipate or mismanagement. For example, the merchant may have bought too many goods to resell, anticipating a too high market price or too many buyers. We then can see that Aquinas gives here a typology of management failure. This typology will remain in later works like the Summa Theologiae. So to conclude, we can highlight 4 points. First, forward sailing is a framework allowing to understand every exchange, even spot exchange. Indeed, transport or imprudence exchanges expenses are risky, but not because of a payment delay, but because of compulsory time between expenses and sailing. Second, we see that prudence constitutes the basis of justice of the exchange and of the assumption of risk. Third, the only effective element of justice Aquinas gives is whether or not the expense can be recovered into the price. Aquinas does not propose any penalty, not even the obligation to return the excess. It is therefore a question of a principle of justice a priori, without entering into the exercise of compensation a posteriori, which would restore justice. Fourth, as justice is addressed through what can or cannot be recovered into the price, we see the growing role of price in ensuring the justice of the exchange, as price is a visible and objective criterion of justice, and Aquinas will use it more and more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pierre. I see John has his hand up, so John, please.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Three quick points. First, it would be helpful to have a little background on the institutional setting of forward markets in the period and whether Aquinas was knowledgeable or clueless about the institutional setting. So when you make a forward contract, do you pay for the goods now or do you pay for them on delivery? Because there's a lot of discussion of a loan being mixed up in here. And if I pay on delivery, that's a very different situation than if I pay when in advance, right? So any background there would be helpful. Second point is that you mentioned that Aquinas doesn't really recognize the economic function of interest and borrowing, but then you gave us the example that you can't pass on interest payments when you're a merchant, which seems to recognize the economic function of borrowing. So I wondered if he's contradictory on that point, or it just struck me a little contradictory. If you talk about that example that I can't pass on my interest payment, it seems like you're already recognizing the commercial function. So maybe think a little about how to phrase that. And then my third crazy point is just to note that I don't know if he realized what backwardization is, but that could be important. And in today, when we talk about the fair price of an option or a futures contract, we have to have the risk-free interest rate as data to make that calculation. So, it's interesting that from the modern perspective, if I don't have the risk-free interest rate, I can't even tell you about the fair price of the option or the future, right? Just an observation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John, for these questions. About institutions of forward market. In fact, his framework is the fair when you can sell something and you can be paid later, and it in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, it's often the case. But the question is that if you are paid later, is it big, and if the price is higher later, is it because of price fluctuation, just because 2 months later the price is up and so the price has increased, or is it because you will put some kind of hidden interest, in fact, in the price, and that's usury, and that's against against that canonists and theologians are striking. This letter is about this case. In fact, the question asked by James of Viterbo to Aquinas is that a merchant selling something and being repaid 3 months later, is it being paid 3 months later? Is it okay or not if the price is higher? And so Aquinas tried to separate the two kinds of reasons. You know, is it because of time or through time, across time? But in fact, it was the question in my previous paper. But in this paper, I tried to find something else in this paper about risks that are not due to forward sale. But in fact, in reading this paper, I said, I thought, in fact, we had some other kinds of risks because he does not only look at the forward sales, but also just licit and illicit expenditure. So I don't know if I answer exactly to the question, but in fact, it was okay to have forward sales, but the question was the reason of an increasing of the price. The second question about the function of the economic function of this. In fact, for Aquinas, we are the economic function is on the delay of payment, but not on the you can't borrow just to develop your activity. It's not. It doesn't see the economic function as of borrowing just for developing business. Not yet, in fact. It's still forbidden. And
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt because we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I think we can have in that couple of minutes Paolo's question and a very short, quick answer, please.
Okay, no, but sorry, Pierre, I didn't want to interrupt your answer. No, but just I mean, if you want to continue answer the previous question, that. But for me, I've got thousands of questions, but I just asked you once. Why? I mean, in this really rigorous work that you have done, because all your papers on Aquinas is very rigorous, you know, Latin. No, it's true.
Thank you, Paolo.
But why do you? What is the need to quote the second book of De Regno? You know that. I mean, that part is very controversial if Aquinas really wrote that part, you know, that perhaps was the part that you quoted, you know, about the Regimine principle. You know that there is there a big issue, you know, if it's the author of that book or not. And I don't know if it adds something to your argument, or perhaps it exposed you to a, you know, a possible, yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I didn't know all these studies of the text. We can discuss about it because it's very interesting. Just one point. In fact, I wanted to show the step by step how it goes from expenses to risk, and in fact, it goes from expensas to periculum. And I found one kind of intermediary step in De Regno with this word discriminum, because in the lexicon, in the vocabulary of risk, discriminum is one of the words. So I said, okay, maybe maybe it is just a step between expensas to periculum. Maybe it's not very interesting. I will thank you for your point.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm sorry I cut short the discussion, but we always have the chat, so we can still use the chat in any case. So let's move to our third presentation by Arild Sæther, How John Locke Discovered and Used Puffendorf's Ideas of Political Economy. Arild, it's to you now, please.
I'm sorry that my registration is such that I can't show you my PowerPoint, but let's leave that. As I'm sure you know, John Locke was born in 1632, so we are now moving 400 years forward from the previous presentation. He was a student at Oxford and he got his bachelor in 1656 and a master in 1659. Thereafter, he became reader in Greek, and then he became censor of moral philosophy in 1663. And his duties was to deliver a series of lectures, The Law of Nature. In the next years, he became associated with the first Earl of Shaftesbury, and this caused Locke to turn to politics and political economy. And since Shaftesbury had a wandering career, so had Locke. They both spent several years in exile, and during these years, Locke wrote, but he did not publish. That he did just when they returned to England, when William and Mary became regent. And that was in 1689, and Locke published his essay concerning human understanding and letter concerning toleration. And the year after, his two treatises of government, in which he discusses the state of nature, natural law, and political economy, was published. And then as late as 1693, he published his thought concerning education. Samuel Puffendorf was born in Saxony in 1632 and grew up during the devastation of the 30 Years' War. He studied at the universities of Leipzig and Jena. After graduation, he became tutor to the children of the Swedish envoy in Copenhagen. But when he arrived in 1658, he was arrested as a spy, and during 8 months of harsh imprisonment, he still managed to write a manuscript on natural law. After he was released, he traveled with the envoy's family to Leiden, where he enrolled at the university. And in 1660, he published his manuscript, Elementorum Jurisprudentia Universalis. This book earned him a chair in natural law at the University of Heidelberg, and it started a career that brought him first to the University of Lund in 1668, to Stockholm as a royal historiographer in 1677, and to Berlin in 1688. And he died in 1694 after a strenuous return journey from Stockholm, where he was elevated into the aristocracy. During his life, Puffendorf published numerous books in natural law, natural law, politics, and history. His major natural law work, the Jura Naturae et Gentium, was published in 1672, and the year after he published a student edition, the Officio Hominis et Civis. Puffendorf employed an eclectic method. He substantiated his natural law with numerous quotations from the Bible, the Quran, the ancient Greek and Romans, and the philosophers of the Middle Ages and the 15th and 16th century. In the 1688 edition of the Jura Naturae et Gentium, we can find 400 names that he refers to, among them Thomas Aquinas. These natural law works encompass what today is understood as ethics, jurisprudence, government, and political economy. Although these subjects are integrated into a totality, we find his political economy in distinct parts: methods of analysis, theory of human behavior, private property, value and money, foundation of states and councils, and finally, division of state powers and principle of taxation. Although Locke was born the same year as Pufendorf, attended university at about the same time, and became a very productive writer during his life, he published most of his writings took place later in his life. However, his writings actually started as early as the beginning of 1660s. It was during the preparation of his lecture on natural law that he wrote down in Latin a manuscript containing these lectures. Locke never published these lectures himself. They were not published before Wolfgang von Leyden translated, edited, and published them in 1954 as John Locke's essay on the law of nature. In his introduction, he discusses Locke's sources. He claims that Puffendorf's Elementoris Jurisprudentia Universalis was important for Locke when he held his first lecture. He also states that Locke had acquired a copy shortly after it was published in 1660. In 1681, he also acquired Puffendorf's other works. According to von Leyden, Locke consulted Puffendorf's Elementorum, quote, for a number of points raised in it are discussed by him, and that Locke in demonstrative sciences of ethics may have been stimulated by remarks in Puffendorf's preface. However, Leyden asserts that Locke's first essays become a foundation that he built his later works on, and that these essays over the rest of his life provided him with topics and inspiration which he turned to account in the building of his own philosophy. Peter Laslet, in his introduction to Locke's two treatises of government from 1964, wrote that Locke only mentioned 6 writers by their names and 2 others by the titles of their works. Laslet therefore finds it idle to look for the sources to Locke's political thinking. But he adds that of the writers Locke consulted, quote, Samuel Puffendorf was perhaps of the greatest use to him, in spite of the fact that their views of constitutional matters were in such contrast. He took advantage of Puffendorf's arguments, he reproduced his positions, and he described his major work as the best book of that kind, better than the great Grotius on War and Peace, unquote. In several footnotes, Laslet shows us how Locke used and built on Puffendorf. From his discussion, Puffendorf was Locke's primary source. In his book, Natural Rights and the New Republicanism from 1994, Michael Zuckert claimed that Locke in his essays quotes and refers to Puffendorf without mentioning his name or citing his book. Locke and his debt to Puffendorf is also discussed by Michael Grove, James Tully, and Helge Hesse. 2 authors that should have recognized Puffendorf's influence on Locke are William Letwin in his The Origin of Scientific Economics from 1963 and Karen Vaughan in her John Locke, Economist and Social Scientist from 1980. Letwin outlines the contribution of many authors, and he recognizes that the doctrines of natural law, quote, with its fusion of scientific principle and moral standard, unquote, was the foundation that Locke built his works on, and that they all also carried over into economics. But Puffendorf is not mentioned. Although Vaughan claims that Locke's economic thought comes primarily from, quote, a combination of his reading of Aristotle, the scholastics, and his contemporaries Grotius and Puffendorf on the one hand, and his own personal observation of economic problem on the other, there are no discussion of how Locke built on any of these authors. Locke and Puffendorf on human behavior. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke outlines his theory of knowledge and his philosophy of science. In addition, he discusses, like Puffendorf, issues such as ethics and philosophy of mind. Although Locke was a devout Christian, he followed Puffendorf in criticizing and rejecting the widely held view that the origin of our knowledge was there from birth. He, like Puffendorf, held the view that knowledge must be acquired. Our mental faculties and other ability to use them may be said to be innate, but it is only by using these faculties that we can acquire knowledge. Since all men are are the workmanship of one wise creator and are in the world to do his business, each one must take care of his own self-interest. Everyone, quote, everyone as he is bound to preserve himself. When his own self-interest is not threatened, he ought, I quote, as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind. The allusions to Puffendorf's self-interest and sociability is clear. As Puffendorf, Locke uses his theory of human behavior to develop a theory of private property. The starting point is the same for Locke as for Puffendorf. The fruits of the earth did not fall into each mouth by themselves. Therefore, even if they were given for the use of man, quote, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or other before they can be of any use or at all beneficial to any particular man. Puffendorf argued that people in a state of nature must obtain the consent of their fellow men before the fruits of the earth can be privately appropriated. At first, this consent could be tacit, but later it must give way to express agreement. Locke departed from Puffendorf and outlined a labor theory of property. He was a persistent champion of the idea that, I quote, every man has a property in his own person. He could also actually have got this idea from Puffendorf, who claimed that, I quote, it was improper that a man who had contributed no labor should have right to things equal to his whose industry a thing had been raised and rendered fit for service. And Locke asked, when things become a man's property, he that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. Here he used an example from Puffendorf, who claimed an oak tree belonged to no man, but the acorns that fell to the ground were his who had gathered them. Locke's account on the subject of value and price is a rudimentary demand and supply theory. He takes over and uses Puffendorf's subjective approach. In some consideration, Locke uses the term quantity and vent, and Puffendorf used scarcity and aptitude. The vent of a good depends on its necessity and usefulness. An estimate of the value of a good can be done by comparing its quantity to its vent. Let me just add that I'm wondering if the differences between Locke and Puffendorf is due to different translation from Latin, but I have not had the time to check. Quantity and vent are approximately equivalent to supply and demand, which also depends on the number of buyers and sellers. The price of any commodity rises or falls by the proportion of the number of buyers and sellers. Fewer buyers will lower the price, fewer sellers will increase the price. The allusions to Puffendorf are remarkable. As with Puffendorf, Locke is also aware of the fact that the most useful things, such as water and air, have no price or a small price. Hence, it is that the best and most useful things are commonly the cheapest, because though their consumptions be great, yet the bounty of Providence has made their production large and suitable to it. From this, it has been suggested that the paradox of value, the diamond water paradox, although known, quote, since the time immemorial, probably entered the stream of economic theory through Locke's considerations. However, the Letwin that said this has probably not studied Puffendorf's writing on value and price and his understanding of this paradox. Pufendorf, from his general theory of value, Locke goes on to develop his theory of money. As with Pufendorf, his theory can be divided into the origin of money, the requirements and the function of money, and what determine its value. I will not go further into this. I will just mention that Locke's view on the foundation of states is found in his second treatise, and these chapters are written in the spirit of Pufendorf. Locke emphasized, like Puffendorf, that the only way men, who from nature are all free, equal, and independent, are willing to put on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with others to unite for their own safety and peaceful livings among others. For Puffendorf and Locke, one form of government is more natural than any other form, and this form is decided on by the majority. However, they each had their preferences. Puffendorf, as Grotius before him, thought about that absolute monarchy is usually the least unsatisfactory, but they were aware that each form, democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, had certain disadvantages. Locke finds that absolute monarchy is inconsistent with civil society, and that he himself preferred moderate monarchies where legislative and executive functions are in different hands. I should also
you have like 1 minute to finish, please.
Thank you. Locke, as well as Puffendorf, consider corruption and evil we have an obligation to resist. Men enter society for the preservation of their property. That is why the authorities, legislative, to make laws and rules, set as guards and fences to the properties of all members of society. Two scholars are central to the spread of natural law, the French philosopher and translator John Locke and John Locke. For some years, these two corresponded. They both admired and spoke highly of Puffendorf. They recommended his work to others and used his natural law works in developing their own theories. There can be no doubt that this recommendation contributed to the use of these works across Europe and North America. Locke became one of the first leading figures of the Enlightenment. Indirectly, the spread of Locke's thoughts therefore had a tremendous effect on the diffusion of Puffendorf's ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor?
If I may use the time to add a small comment to the previous. Your presentation tells me that lecturers that teach business economics could benefit from the study of Aquinas. And a former friend of mine, which you had quoted or was on your list, Odd Langholm, he always, when he taught business economics, also taught them about Thomas Aquinas. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Arild.
I just smiled to you now, just so you know.
Okay. Maybe just a quick, very, very quick question. It's kind of an unarticulated question. I was wondering, this parallel you make of looking for the influence of Puffendorf on Locke, does this give you an insight about things, about new interpretations of Locke's work? Does this give you insights about different worries from what has been generally addressed in Lockean scholarship?
Well, I'm sorry to say that from my, of course, I have, since I turned upon Puffendorf and has written about him and his importance for the development of economics, unfortunately, mostly because of Immanuel Kant, natural law was was kind of pushed aside, to put it nicely. But it was very important for a lot of people. And I think, in a way, to be fair, to tell the story, we should, of course, Puffendorf was an eclectic, as I said. He used, for example, Aquinas and in his study, and he wrote then, integrated all these different people, the teaching of all these different people into his natural law. And then his natural law was taken over by all the other. And I think that this story may be because the British, to put it that way, they don't like that their people like Locke or like Hutcheson or like Smith, that they, of course, were scholars. And at that time, they had access not only to their own books, but to the books that was published all around Europe. They came to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and they circulated among the people and so on. And I would have liked that more people should recognize this fact. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an important point, I think. So let's move to our last presentation by Paolo Santori, who's presenting joint work with Luigino Bruni, Theological Voluntarism and the Invisible Hand from Duns to Smith via Calvin. Thank you, Paolo.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, now I'm under a lot of pain because I managed to injure myself on the shoulders trying to stretch. So I will do my best to do this presentation, but okay, I hope you can see my screen. Now I will try. Okay, so Theological Voluntarism and the Invisible Hand from Duns Scotus to Smith via Calvin. This is a working paper that I wrote with Luigino Bruni, and we hoped that we were able to present it in person, also because I'm in Tilburg now, very close to Utrecht. So it's too bad that now we are in this soft lockdown. But since I've got 15 minutes, let me tell you, and I sent you the latest version so that you can read more about all the ungrounded claims that I'm about to tell you. But basically what we argue is that medieval theological voluntarism, which is a theological doctrine that I'm about to explain, created the ontological space from which the 18th century political economy view of the market arose. Of course, I'm not talking about cause and effect. I'm talking about a connection. And it's impossible to show this in 15 minutes, and it's also even hard to prove in 24 pages, which is the actual length of the paper. But just to let you know, of course, this is a building block of a larger inquiry that we are doing, that Professor Bruni is doing before me, but now together into the theological and philosophical history of modern economic ideas and modern schools of economic thought. So the research question is very general, and it is the one that you can read on the slide. So how it's possible that modern economic science emerged from the medieval Christian world, where, I mean, if you, like Pierre, studied the medieval theologians, both late Middle Age and high Middle Age, I mean, the attitude toward merchants, profit, commerce, self-interest, lucrum, was mostly condemnation and reprobation. Okay, there were some room for the idea that profit, moderate profit, lucrum moderatum is admissible, but still there was always, a veil of suspicion, I look toward the economic sphere. And of course, we know that Protestantism in the transition between Middle Age and modernity had a fundamental role in many senses. I mean, now I have no time even to list them. But what is our specific contribution? We want to say, look, if we look closely to the theological disputes of late Middle Ages, and in particular to the theological dispute between voluntarism and intellectualism, then you find something interesting to answer this very same question that we asked ourselves. So what we argue more in depth is that voluntarism allowed Christian theologians who embraced it to imagine a new ontological space within which commerce and self-interest could be praised as such. That's the point. You know, not that you have lucrum moderatum, you know, that is, okay, to gain from trade is good if, you know, like a Kantian hypothetical imperative, means to something else. No, self-interest and lucrum as such, you know, profit as such is good, not because you intentionally direct it to the common good, but because it's good. And what we argue is that voluntarism somehow undermined the Aristotelian and Thomism, but even Roman virtue ethics that was very widespread in late Middle Age, especially this idea that is one of the building block of virtue ethics, that if you want to contribute to the common good, this has to be intentional. So you have to intentionally direct your virtuous action toward common good. As you know, virtue, Latin habitus, from the Greek exis, which means a repeated intentional action, you know. And starting from the zoon politikon of Aristotle to the naturalite Roma homini amicus est, the Aquinas, there is the idea that human flourishment is connected to this idea of the promotion of common good, and it is helped by the promotion of common good. Now, voluntarism challenged this view. And voluntarism is very complex theological concept, and we chose one of the, let's say, intellectual adversary of Thomas Aquinas, who is John Scotus, who is a Franciscan friar, as you know, because he was one of the first to theorize voluntarism, even if then it evolved with Occam and with other Via Moderna, Schola Agostiniana. I mean, it took many routes, but John Scotus was the one who go very in depth on that concept. Now, so what is okay? So what we also argue? We argue so that there is a thread somehow, an invisible thread between the two Scots. You know, John Scotus was originated from Scotland, and he studied at Oxford, and Adam Smith. So that there is, you know, a thread connecting these two authors, and we think that there is a passage, a mediation between Duns Scotus and Smith, and again, I'm not talking about a connection, because as far as I know, Adam Smith didn't read books of Duns Scotus. I don't know if some of you are aware of this. But anyway, we think that mediated by Calvin and Calvinism, there is room to promote the idea that this theological argument will create an ontological space was mediated by Calvinism and arrived even to the idea of invisible end of Adam Smith. So the idea that the common good can be promoted unintentionally. So there is this basic difference. I can see that there is one comment in the chat, but I cannot read it. So if it's important, stop me. Otherwise, I will continue. So common good can be promoted unintentionally. So this is using images, the idea that we are trying to develop in the paper. So Duns Scotus on the left, Calvin in the middle, and Smith looking at them. Okay, what is voluntarism? Now, I put here voluntarism explained to my niece, not because, my niece is not intelligent, because she's 3 years old, but the idea is that what is the core, you know, of the dispute, of the view of voluntarism and this dispute between intellectualism and voluntarism? Well, it concerns, first of all, the God action regarding creation, you know. So you have, imagine to look at God in the moment, if there was a moment of creation. And so you have two options. So God thinks the world and at the same time will it. So intellectualism, the idea is that the voluntas, the will of God, actually is not at the same time for intellectualism, even if Aquinas is more nuanced in this. But the idea is that the will is secondary. So God first thinks the word and then willed it. Whereas for voluntarism, God wills the word and then thinks it. Now, this has a huge ontological consequences if you choose for an option over the other. Why? Because in intellectualism, the essence of creation is strongly tied to the essence of creator, because the world is first and foremost the product of God's intellect. So I mean, there is a connection. Of course, in Aquinas is an analogy, is not an identification, but still it's a strong connection. On the other end, we have voluntarism, in which there is a big gap between the essence of creation and the essence of creator. Why? Because God first willed something, then used his intellect to imagine, to structure a world that can be connected to that something. So, there is a gap. And to let you understand better what I mean, in intellectualism, the ontological structure of the world is perfectly designed to reach the ends that God willed, loved. So let's imagine that at the moment of creation, God thought to create reality, to reach some end, and then he structures reality in the best possible way, Leibniz, some hiccups here, to arrive to that end. Whereas in voluntarism, the ontological structure of the world is designed to reach the ends that God will, but it's not perfectly designed. It was just one of the options that God could have chosen, so it's more, there were many means, many possible configuration of reality. God chosen one, and that is the one that is actual. So intellectualism, there is no gap between means and ends. In voluntarism, yes. And you can understand this if you look at what Duns Scotus says about the difference between ordained power and absolute power. So at the moment of creation, God used his absolute power, his ex potentia Dei absoluta. So he chose a possible configuration of the world. He committed himself to that configuration of the world. So, okay, the reality works like this, and God respects that the essence of the reality that he created. But as Duns Scotus interestingly stressed, the idea is that not only God is always able to overturn, to go over the laws of nature that he has established, so the connection between divine law and the law of nature. But he's able, if you read the latest quote, I put the quote in red, such an agent can act otherwise, so that it establishes another upright law, which, if it were set up by God, would be right, because no law is right except insofar as the divine will accept it as established. So it's the divine will that has precedence, that established laws. Now, why these theological ideas are interest for people who study economics? I've got 3 minutes, impossible. So you have Aquinas as an exponent of intellectualism and Duns Scotus of voluntarism. So let's assume that society is created to reach the common good, and people have to intentionally contribute to the common good. How can a merchant contribute to the common good? This is the question that, if you read Aquinas' answer, is this, that gain is allowed, but a moderate gain. As I told you, gain as such is not allowed for Aquinas. And what is interesting is that the same is for Duns Scotus. And now you might say, okay, so why did you distinguish between intellectualism and voluntarism if the outcome is the same? That here at the very end, Duns Scotus says that the justice in exchange echoes the reciprocal love that you can read in the gospel. So I mean, because for Duns Scotus, the word, the structure for reality that we see is ex potentia Dei ordinata. For Aquinas, this distinction is not like this. So Aquinas' ideas are those, and they can be modified, but they cannot be revoked or reversed. For Duns Scotus, this is one of the possible configurations, but it can change. And he shows that change here in the issue of private property, because Aquinas and Duns Scotus thought the very same thing about private property, that before the fall, the possession of things was in common and there was no private property. After the original sin, private property was established, okay? So they agree on this. But now let's see a difference. Because Aquinas said, look, he said, after the fall, two things are competent to man in respect of exterior things. One is the power to procure and dispense them, and in this regard, it is lawful for men to possess property. The second thing that is competent to men with regard to external things is their use. On this respect, man ought to possess external things, not as his own, but as common, so that, to wit, he is ready to communicate them to others in their need. Hence, the ownership of possession is not contrary to the natural law, but an addition. Even after the original sin, the natural law cannot be revoked, can be changed, can be modified, but not revoked. You know, this is an Aristotelian idea that Aquinas applied to this case to say, look, after the original sin, man was weak, humanity is a massa damnata, is difficult to be virtuous. And so it's good that there is private property, but still private property as such that you care about your own good, it's not enough to contribute to the common good of society. Whereas Scotus, and this is very interesting, adopt a similar but very different position. Why? Because after the fall of man, this law of nature of holding all things in common was revoked, not modified or added, was revoked. And this also was reasonable for Scotus for two reasons. First of all, because communality of property after the fall would have militated against the peaceful life. The common good of society is the peaceful life. You know, so the ends remain, you know, that you have a peaceful life. And as you know, in Middle Age, peace means positive peace, something in which you can develop your own virtue. But the evil or covetous man without private property would take more than he needed. And to do so, he would have used violence against others who wished to use these common goods for their own needs. The original law would have also have failed to ensure the necessary sustenance of mankind, for the stronger warriors would have deprived the others of the test. If you read this part of Dun Scotus Ordinatio, there is no reference on the fact that you have to, you know, use your things to contribute to the common good in their use in whatever way. It's enough that you care about your own property, because you keep peace, you contribute to the common good of society. This is not, of course, an invisible end mechanism, but still the intentionality disappears here. You can care about your private good, you know, and this is important to foster the peaceful life, the common good of society. So and I'm concluding because I know it's I'm very late. After the fall, human being changed. For Aquinas, you have an attitude of virtue which is diminished but not eliminated. For Scotus, at least in the doctrine of private property, humanity is like, for Augustine, a massa damnata. We are evil, uncivil, not capable of virtue. And the question is, how do you relate a massa damnata to common good? So the ends, the common good, remain. But the means are changed, the conditions are changed. Man, human being is changed. Human being is now a massa damnata. And I conclude, what is interesting is that John Calvin, so Calvinism here, he said, look, Duns Scotus, when he did this distinction between ex potentia de ordinata and absoluta, was wrong. But because this distinction was, why was wrong Duns Scotus for Calvin? Because for Scotus, ex potentia dei ordinata, so the word as it is, looks too similar to the one of Aquinas. Whereas, as we see in the case of a contract, whereas for him, he said, this distinction between the two powers of God have been made by St. Augustine. And St. Augustine made this, showing that there is always harmony between them, because then he somehow theorized this idea that even a massa damnata can contribute to the common good unintentionally, that there is some operation, some kind of providence that, you know, harness some individual evil actions toward the common good. And then you can see, you know, what unintentional for Calvin is this, you know, contribution. And as you know, and I conclude, there is this beautiful and less quoted article by Peter Harrison, so Adam Smith and this invisible end, in which he shows that Adam Smith was exposed to this idea of invisible end, which was widespread in you know, in Calvinist, you know, so climate. So to conclude, yeah, I finished. So voluntarism was a theological doctrine. What do we claim? That voluntarism is a theological doctrine who opened an ontological space in which self-interest, profit, merchant activity could be seen favorably as such. So for us, Duns Scotus did not make all the step. In the private property, yes, but in other parts, no. He left open the door. Of course, there is no direct influence of Duns Scotus or Smith, but the history that ties this is more complicated. And of course, we connected this because we say if voluntarism can be connected to political economy, can we imagine a link between intellectualism and civil economy, Aquinas, and so Aquinas and Genovese, which is the argument that, you know, a little bit explore in this book that I put very, very small here. So, you know, this is overall our paper, and I thank you for your attention. And I won't pronounce this Dutch word at the end because it's not able, but it means gratis, grosch. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. We have like 1 minute, no, minus 1 minute for questions.
You can send me to an email, I don't know.
Okay, somebody, any question? No, I can't. Please let me just ask the question and then you write back. And so the question is about the gap. In the does free will lie in that gap? And would that gap mean that we might not reach the end God wills?
Yeah, no.
Yep.
So no.
Okay.
We always because there is the operation of providence, and so unintentionally or intentionally we are going to reach that end. You know, that's. But I can write you a more extensive reply if you want.
Because I'm still wondering about the invisible hand as the hand of providence. So that's.
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, so thank you everybody for being here. Thanks to the presenters for keeping the time. I think it was a very interesting session. I learned a lot. Thank you all, and see you tomorrow. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.